March 7th, 1943, 0342 hours, North Atlantic. The depth charge rolled off the stern rack of USS Buckley with a sound like a church bell being dropped into hell, the 650-pound cylinder of TNT and steel rattling against the metal guides with a shriek that made Callahan's teeth ache. Petty Officer, 3rd Class, Raymond Red Callahan watched it tumble through the pre-dawn darkness, spinning end over end as it plunged toward the black water 40 feet below, and felt the familiar sick certainty that they were about to waste another perfectly good explosive on empty ocean. The weapon hit the Atlantic with a splash that sounded almost gentle compared to what would come next. 600 pounds of TNT sinking at 15 feet per second toward a detonation depth of 150 feet, where it would kill nothing but fish and create another spectacular fountain of seawater that would make the crew cheer and the U-boats laugh. Around him, the destroyer escort's fantail deck vibrated with the twin diesel engines pushing Buckley to flank speed, 23 knots through swells that climbed 15 feet and dropped into troughs deep enough to make his stomach climb into his throat and his knees buckle against the deck plating. The convoy was 6 miles ahead, 47 merchant ships carrying aviation fuel, ammunition, and 12,000 replacement troops for the European theater. Somewhere beneath those dark waters prowled at least 3 German U-boats that had already put 2 tankers on the bottom in the past 4 hours. SS William C. Gorgas torpedoed at 23:14 hours with 38 crew killed. SS Jeremiah Wadsworth hit at 0147 hours with 52 men drowned in water so cold it killed in 4 minutes. The North Atlantic in March was 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to stop a man's heart before hypothermia could finish the job. Callahan had seen the bodies recovered from the first tanker. Their skin had been blue-white, their limbs frozen in positions that suggested they'd been trying to swim when the cold locked their muscles solid. One sailor's mouth had been open in a scream that ice had preserved forever. Callahan wasn't supposed to be on the fantail. His battle station was in the galley 3 decks below, cooking breakfast for a crew of 186 men who'd be too seasick to eat it anyway. But for the past 11 days, every time the alarm bell clanged and Buckley raced toward a sonar contact, Callahan had abandoned his stove and climbed topside to watch the depth charge attacks. He'd watched them drop 93 charges in 11 days. He'd seen exactly 0 confirmed U-boat kills. The pattern was always the same. Sonar would ping a target at 200 feet, the captain would order a pattern of 6 charges, the weapons would splash into the water and disappear, and 40 seconds later massive explosions would erupt from deep below, throwing columns of white water 80 feet into the air and shaking Buckley's hull hard enough to rattle coffee cups in the galley and knock loose rivets out of deck plating. The ocean would boil, the crew would cheer, and absolutely nothing would die down there except fish, and the hope that maybe this time would be different. The problem was simple, brutal, obvious to anyone who'd spent time thinking about it instead of just following procedures. The depth charges were set to detonate at 150 feet because that's where U-boats typically ran when they dove to escape. But the German submarines weren't diving anymore. They'd figured out the math. A Type 7C U-boat could make 17 knots on the surface using diesel engines. Submerged on battery power, she could barely manage 7 knots, and only for an hour before the batteries died, and she had to surface anyway. So the U-boats were staying on the surface, running at 17 knots, outpacing the convoy's 11-knot speed, positioning themselves ahead of the merchant ships like wolves getting ahead of a herd of sheep. Then they'd submerge to periscope depth, maybe 40 feet, 50 at most, just long enough to fire torpedoes before surfacing again to reload and reposition. They were exploiting a tactical gap that nobody in the Atlantic Fleet had figured out how to close. Depth charges that exploded at 150 feet were useless against submarines running at 40, and the hydrostatic detonators couldn't be reliably set for depths less than 50 feet without risking premature explosions that would blow the stern off the ship, dropping them. Callahan had been thinking about this problem since February 23rd, when he'd watched Buckley chase a U-boat for 7 hours and drop 41 depth charges without achieving a single solid hit. He'd thought about it while peeling 300 pounds of potatoes. He'd thought about it while baking 60 loaves of bread in the galley's temperamental ovens that never held temperature and burned everything on the left side. He'd thought about it at night in his rack, staring at the pipes running along the ceiling 18 inches above his face, listening to the sonar pinging through the hull. Ping, 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 listening to the crew talk in the darkness about the mounting losses. Since January 1st, U-boats had sunk 127 Allied merchant ships in the North Atlantic, 627,000 tons of cargo, approximately 4,200 sailors drowned or frozen. That number grew every day. Every convoy lost ships. Every attack failed to sink U-boats. The mathematics were brutal and getting worse. And 3 nights ago, lying awake during the midnight watch while the ship creaked and groaned through heavy seas, Callahan had realized something that might be either brilliant or stupid. He'd grown up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, fishing Georges Bank with his father from age 9 to 17. Lobster pots, trawl nets, cod lines. Commercial fishing taught you practical physics the hard way. You either learned how to keep equipment at the right depth, or you lost it and didn't eat. His father had shown him 100 times how to rig a lobster pot to stay exactly 60 feet down using a combination of weight and float. The pot was heavy enough to sink, the float was buoyant enough to stop it at the right depth, and physics did the rest. Simple. Reliable. No complicated mechanisms, no expensive equipment, just rope, weight, and buoyancy. Depth charges were heavy. They sank. That was the weight part. What they needed was the float part, something to stop them at 40 feet, instead of letting them sink all the way to 150. And Buckley had hundreds of floats aboard. They were called life preservers, and they were sitting in emergency equipment lockers doing nothing while men drowned because depth charges couldn't kill submarines. He waited until the 6th charge tumbled into the water, waited until the underwater detonations threw their massive geysers skyward, 6 columns of white water erupting simultaneously in a line 200 yards long, the shockwaves hitting Buckley hard enough to make the deck ring like a struck bell and throw spray high enough to soak the forward gun crews. The water in the geysers wasn't white because it was clean. It was white because the explosions had turned it to foam, millions of tiny bubbles created by 3,600 pounds of TNT, detonating 150 feet below the surface and vaporizing everything within a 30-foot radius. For 5 seconds, the ocean looked like it was boiling. Then the water collapsed back into the Atlantic, and the surface was dark again. And somewhere out there, 3 U-boats were still hunting. Callahan waited until Buckley turned hard to port to begin another attack run, waited until the fantail crew started preparing the next pattern of charges. Then he climbed down the ladder to the weapons deck, found Chief Boatswain's mate William Kowalski checking the remaining depth charge inventory, and said 7 words that would either get him court-martialed or change the Battle of the Atlantic. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from 11 days of watching men drown because nobody could figure out how to kill submarines that wouldn't dive deep. "Chief, I know how to fix this." Kowalski was 43 years old, 24 years in the Navy, the kind of chief who'd survived Guadalcanal, Midway, and the opening months of the Atlantic convoy battles by trusting his instincts about which sailors knew what they were talking about and which ones were just talking. He'd seen enough combat to know that good ideas came from unexpected places, and enough death to know that conventional tactics weren't working. He looked at Callahan for 3 seconds, his face expressionless in the red glow of the battle lamps, looked at the depth charge racks where 4 more 600-pounders sat waiting to be wasted on empty water, looked back at Callahan. "You're a cook." "I'm from Gloucester, Massachusetts," Callahan replied, forcing his voice to stay steady. Fished George Bank with my father from age 9 to 17. Lobster pots, trawl nets, cod lines. You want to keep something at a specific depth? You use a bridle and a float. Basic physics, Chief. Same principle should work on a depth charge. He'd been rehearsing this explanation for 3 days, working out the details in his head, sketching diagrams on scrap paper during the quiet hours in the galley when he should have been inventorying flour and salt pork. The concept was so simple it seemed impossible that nobody had thought of it before. Attach a length of rope to the depth charge. Attach the other end to a float calibrated to provide exactly enough buoyancy to counteract the weapon's negative buoyancy, and the charge would sink to the length of the rope and then hold at that depth until the hydrostatic detonator triggered the explosion. 40 feet of rope meant 40 feet of depth. 40 feet was exactly where these surfaced U-boats were most vulnerable. Or I'm about to waste $6 of rope and get us all killed trying. Kowalski stared at him. Around them, the crew was preparing for another attack run. Sonar was calling out ranges. Contact bearing 047, range 800 yards, target depth estimated 40 feet, speed 12 knots. The captain was shouting orders from the bridge. Buckley was turning into position for Pattern Baker, another 6 charges that would explode harmlessly at 150 feet, while the U-boat cruised away at 40. The chief made a decision that would save 4,200 lives and transform naval warfare across 3 oceans. Show me. Callahan led Kowalski to the rope locker, a cramped compartment aft of the main deck where 400 feet of manila line was stored in coils that smelled like tar and salt. He grabbed a section of 3/4-inch rope, measured out 40 feet by walking the length heel to toe against the deck. 48 steps at 10 inches per step equals 480 inches equals 40 feet. His hands worked automatically with the rigger's knife, cutting the rope with the kind of clean diagonal slice that came from years of practice. The rope was standard Navy issue, 750-pound test strength, treated with tar to resist saltwater rot. It cost approximately 15 cents per foot at Norfolk Supply Depot. Total cost for this modification, $6, less than a tank of gas, less than dinner for 2 at a decent restaurant in Boston. $6 to kill a submarine. The float was trickier. Callahan needed something that would provide approximately 300 pounds of buoyancy to partially offset the depth charge's 650-pound weight, allowing the weapon to sink slowly until the rope reached full extension at 40 feet. He found what he needed in a storage compartment near the damage control station. Kapok life preservers, the kind designed to keep an unconscious sailor's head above water in seas cold enough to kill. Each preserver provided 35 pounds of buoyancy. Simple division. 300 pounds divided by 35 pounds equals 8.57. Round up to 9 preservers to be safe. He grabbed them off their hooks, bright orange Kapok-filled vests that had been inspected last month and would now be repurposed to kill Germans. Are you planning to steal emergency life-saving equipment? Kowalski asked, in a tone that wasn't quite a question. Or are you planning to requisition it through proper supply channels while German submarines torpedo the convoy we're supposed to be protecting? Callahan grabbed 9 life preservers. He lashed them together with cord, wrapping the bundle tight enough that it wouldn't come apart under the violent stress of deployment. His fingers worked on autopilot, half hitches and square knots, the kind of knots you learned in your sleep when you grew up on fishing boats. He attached one end of the 40-foot rope to the bundle using a sheet bend that would hold under any load short of cutting the rope itself. Coiled the rope carefully to prevent tangling during deployment. Clockwise coils, each loop the same size, the kind of attention to detail that separated professional mariners from amateurs who lost gear and wondered why. The entire assembly weighed approximately 25 pounds and could be carried by 1 man. Installation on a depth charge would take 30 seconds. Tie the free end of the rope to the weapon's tail fins using a bowline knot, the kind of knot Callahan had tied 10,000 times on his father's fishing boat, the kind that wouldn't slip under tension, but could be released instantly after recovery if the charge failed to detonate. He held up the completed rig for Kowalski's inspection. Orange kapok bundle, 40 feet of tarred manila rope, one end with a sheet bend, other end ready for a bowline. This is either going to work perfectly, Chief, or it's going to sink straight to the bottom and do nothing. What about premature detonation? Kowalski asked. Kowalski, if that float drags across the surface and triggers the hydrostatic fuse before the charge reaches depth, the float stays on the surface. The charge sinks to 40 feet. The rope connects them. The hydrostatic pressure at 40 feet triggers the detonator. Basic physics, same as a lobster pot. Callahan knew the risks better than he wanted to admit. A depth charge detonating too close to Buckley's stern would damage the ship's screws, possibly blow the rudder off, definitely kill anyone standing on the fantail. The shock wave from 600 pounds of TNT exploding at 40 feet would hit the ship's hull like a physical punch. Rivets might shear, welds might crack, men might die. But German torpedoes would definitely kill the 217 men aboard the Liberty ship Thomas Jefferson, steaming 4 miles ahead if Buckley didn't find a way to sink these U-boats in the next 30 minutes. The mathematics of acceptable risk were ugly but simple. Gamble 6 lives on the fantail versus guarantee 217 deaths in the convoy. Not a hard choice. Kowalski made his decision. Install it on charge number 7. I'll tell the captain we're testing experimental ordnance. If it works, we'll rig the rest of the charges. If it doesn't work, you're going to spend the rest of this convoy run peeling potatoes and wondering why you didn't stay in the galley where you belong. He paused. And if it detonates prematurely and blows our stern off, you're going to spend eternity explaining to St. Peter why you thought rope and life preservers were a good substitute for naval engineering. Callahan carried his rope rig to the depth charge rack where weapon number 7 sat waiting. The Mark 7 depth charge was a brutal piece of engineering designed by people who understood physics and violence. A steel barrel 18 inches in diameter, 36 inches tall, filled with 600 pounds of TNT packed so dense it felt solid as concrete. The hydrostatic detonator was a mechanical marvel of gears and springs and pressure-sensitive triggers calibrated to fire when water pressure reached specific thresholds. Set to 150 feet, the mechanism would wait until 66 pounds per square inch of pressure compressed the trigger spring, then fire a blasting cap that would detonate the main charge in a fraction of a second. The explosion would create a shock wave traveling through water at 5,000 feet per second. A wall of compressed water and expanding gas powerful enough to crush a submarine's pressure hull at ranges up to 30 feet. Everything about the weapon was optimized for killing U-boats at depth. Nobody had seriously considered what would happen if you deliberately kept one shallow. He tied the rope to the tail fins using a bowline, checking the knot 3 times with hands that had stopped shaking and now moved with the kind of mechanical precision that came from muscle memory overriding nerves. Loop the rope around the fin strut. Thread the working end through the loop, around the standing part, back down through the original loop. Tighten. Test with 50 pounds of pull. Hold solid. The kapok float bundle sat on the deck beside the charge, bright orange against the gray steel, looking so ridiculous that Callahan almost laughed. It looked like someone had gift-wrapped a depth charge with emergency equipment. It looked improvised, desperate, stupid. It looked exactly like what it was. A $6 modification created by a cook who'd spent too much time thinking about lobster pots. Kowalski stood beside him, watching silently. Other crew members were starting to notice. Seaman First Class Jake Morrison walked past hauling ammunition for the forward guns, saw the rope rig, stopped dead. "What the hell is that, Cookie?" "Experimental ordnance modification," Kowalski said, in a tone that made it clear further questions would be unwise and possibly painful. Morrison nodded slowly and moved on, but Callahan could see him glancing back every few steps. could see other sailors starting to gather near the depth charge rack. Word was spreading fast in the way that news always spread on a destroyer escort. One sailor saw something unusual, told another sailor, who told 3 more, and within 5 minutes the entire crew knew that the cook had tied a bunch of life preservers to a depth charge, and the chief was letting him do it, and either this was brilliant or everyone on the fantail was about to die. The captain's voice crackled over the ship's intercom, metallic and urgent. Sonar contact bearing 047, range 800 yards, target depth estimated 40 feet, speed 12 knots, all hands to battle stations, prepare depth charge attack, pattern Baker. The familiar sequence was beginning again. Buckley would race toward the contact at flank speed. The sonar operator would call out ranges in a monotone that never changed, no matter how close they got to death. The fantail crew would roll charges off the stern rack in a predetermined pattern. 6 weapons spaced 8 seconds apart, creating a kill zone 200 yards long. 6 explosions would erupt at 150 feet. The U-boat at 40 feet would survive undamaged. And somewhere 4 miles ahead, German submarine commanders would be calculating firing solutions for torpedoes that would kill 217 men. Except this time, weapon number 7 would be different. This time, Callahan's rope rig would either prove that a cook from Gloucester knew more about killing submarines than the Naval Ordnance Bureau, or it would sink to the bottom and join the 92 other wasted depth charges Buckley had already dropped. Kowalski climbed to the fantail and gave the rollout crew their instructions. Charges 1 through 6, standard deployment. Charge 7 has experimental rigging. When you roll it, make sure that float bundle goes over immediately after. Don't let the rope foul on the rack. He demonstrated the deployment sequence. Roll the charge, count 1 second, throw the float bundle. Simple. Except at 23 knots in 15-foot swells with German submarines hunting the convoy, nothing was simple. The crew members nodded, but Callahan could see the doubt in their faces, the way their eyes kept flicking to the Kapok float bundle like it was a bomb about to explode. They'd been dropping depth charges for months. They knew what worked and what didn't. A rope and some life preservers didn't look like naval ordnance. It looked like something a desperate man had improvised because proper solutions weren't available. Which was exactly what it was. Buckley accelerated to flank speed. The twin diesel engines roared, pushing 1,500 horsepower through the twin screws, driving the destroyer escort through the black water at 23 knots. The bow lifted. Spray flew over the forward deck in white sheets that soaked the gun crews and turned the deck slippery. The ship carved through the Atlantic like a knife, closing on the sonar contact. Range 600 yards, 400. The numbers counted down like a death sentence. 200 yards, 100. The sonar operator's voice never changed, never showed fear or excitement, just kept calling out ranges in the same flat monotone he'd used for 93 previous attacks that had accomplished nothing. At 100 yards, sonar lost contact. The target had passed into the acoustic shadow directly beneath Buckley's hull, the blind spot where sonar couldn't penetrate because the sound waves bounced off the ship's own hull instead of traveling downward. Losing contact meant the U-boat was exactly where they wanted it, directly in the path of the depth charge pattern about to be deployed. Or it meant the U-boat had dove to 200 feet and was currently laughing while Buckley wasted another 6 explosives on empty ocean. "Drop pattern Baker," the captain shouted from the bridge. The fantail crew rolled charge number 1 off the stern rack. The 650-pound weapon tumbled through space and hit the Atlantic with a splash. 4 seconds later, charge 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6. The weapons splashed into the water at precisely calculated intervals, spacing determined by Buckley's speed and the time required for each charge to sink to detonation depth. Physics and mathematics working together to create a kill zone that would be utterly useless if the U-boat stayed at 40 feet. Then came charge number 7, Callahan's modified weapon, rolling off the rack with 40 feet of rope trailing behind it like a tail, tumbling end over end toward the black water. Seaman Morrison held the kapok float bundle in both hands, waiting for the moment. The depth charge hit the water. Morrison counted, 1 Mississippi, and threw the float bundle overboard exactly as Kowalski had instructed. Callahan watched from the weapons deck, his breath locked in his chest. The kapok float hit the water and immediately spread across the surface, 9 life preservers lashed together, creating a bright orange mass approximately 6 feet across. The depth charge sank. The rope played out behind it, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. Callahan could see it in his mind. The charge was sinking at 15 feet per second, pulling the rope taut, the float providing resistance, the physics playing out exactly as he'd calculated on scrap paper in the galley. 40 feet. The rope reached full extension. The depth charge stopped sinking. The hydrostatic pressure at 40 feet started compressing the detonator mechanism. 5-second fuse. The charge was hanging suspended at 40 feet like a lobster pot waiting for the trap to close. The first 6 charges detonated right on schedule. Massive underwater explosions erupted at 150 feet deep. 6 simultaneous detonations that merged into one continuous roar. The shockwaves traveled upward through the water column and hit the surface with enough force to throw columns of white water 80 feet into the air. The Atlantic boiled. Foam spread across the surface in white rings that expanded outward at 30 feet per second. The noise was overwhelming. Not just sound, but physical pressure that Callahan could feel in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth. Buckley's hull rang like a bell. Loose equipment rattled. Men braced themselves against the shockwaves. Then charge number 7 exploded. The detonation was different. Shallower. Closer. The shockwave hit Buckley like a physical fist. Callahan's teeth clacked together hard enough to draw blood from his tongue. His vision grayed at the edges. The deck plating rang like a struck bell, a sound so loud it drowned out everything else. In the weapons locker, loose equipment, wrenches, ammunition clips, someone's coffee mug, launched themselves across the compartment and clattered against the opposite bulkhead with enough force to dent the metal. The ship shuddered bow to stern. Spray thrown 60 feet high by the shallow explosion crashed across the fantail with the force of a fire hose, cold enough to burn, hard enough to knock Seaman Morrison off his feet and send him sliding across the deck until he slammed into the depth charge rack and grabbed it to stop himself from going overboard. And 80 feet astern, where the orange kapok float had been bobbing on the surface, an enormous geyser erupted. Not white water, brown water, oil-black water, water mixed with debris and fuel and pieces of things that had been intact 40 seconds ago. The column of water climbed 70 feet into the air before gravity pulled it back down. The noise was different too. Not just the explosion, but a secondary sound. A deep, groaning, metallic shriek that carried across the water like a scream, the sound of steel being torn apart by forces it was never designed to withstand. Then, the oil came up. Black crude oil erupting from below the surface in pulsing gouts, spreading across the water in a slick 40 feet wide that caught the first gray light of dawn and turned it the color of dried blood. The oil wasn't smooth. It was churning, boiling, thrown upward by explosions still happening below the surface as fuel tanks ruptured and compressed air escaped from dying compartments. Then debris. Wooden planks that had been interior bulkheads 30 seconds ago. Clothing still warm from the bodies that wore it. Documents with German script, the ink already starting to run as seawater dissolved it. A boot, a life vest, a sailor's cap with Kriegsmarine insignia. Pieces of equipment Callahan couldn't identify. Valves, pipes, gauges, fragments of steel torn into shapes that physics textbooks didn't have names for. Then bodies. 3 of them. German sailors in dark coveralls floating face down in the expanding oil slick, arms spread wide like they were embracing the Atlantic that killed them. Their life vests had kept their heads above water, but couldn't keep them alive. The shockwave had killed them instantly through their life vests, through their coveralls, through their skin. Internal hemorrhaging, ruptured organs, shattered bones, death by physics. One had blood leaking from his ears, thin red streams that mixed with the oil and created swirls of color that looked almost artistic. Another's mouth was open in a scream that would never end, frozen the moment his lungs collapsed. The third was face up somehow, defying the natural tendency of corpses to float face down. His eyes were open, staring at the pre-dawn sky. He looked 22 years old, maybe younger. And then, 40 seconds after charge 7 detonated, the bow of a Type 7C U-boat broke the surface at a 60-degree angle. Not surfacing. Dying. The submarine's bow punched through the water like a breaching whale, but wrong. Too steep. Too fast. Seawater poured from the conning tower hatches in torrents. Not drainage, evacuation. The submarine was flooding. The ocean was killing it from the inside. White foam mixed with black oil. The bow climbed higher. 70 degrees. The submarine was standing nearly vertical in the water, her stern on the ocean floor 200 feet down, her bow pointing at the sky like an accusing finger. Then Callahan saw the hull damage. The submarine's starboard side was torn open along a 15-foot section just aft of the conning tower. The steel plating, pressure hull rated for 220 meters of depth, armor-grade steel half an inch thick, was peeled back like aluminum foil. The edges of the tear were jagged, curled outward by the force of the explosion. He could see into the interior. Dark compartments, pipes, equipment, bodies. Some of them were still moving. Callahan could hear them screaming. The sound carried across 80 feet of open water, high-pitched and desperate, the sound of men who knew they were about to die and couldn't do anything to stop it. German words he didn't understand, but the meaning was universal. Help us. Save us. We're drowning. The bow tilted higher. 80 degrees. Vertical. The screaming cut off as the submarine slid backward into the Atlantic, stern first, the bow following in a smooth motion that took 4 seconds. The oil slick closed over where U-552 had been, and the screaming was gone, and 47 German submariners who'd been hunting Allied convoys 40 seconds ago were dead at the bottom of the North Atlantic. The silence after the submarine disappeared was louder than the explosions had been. Nobody on Buckley's fantail spoke. They stood frozen, watching the oil slick spread, watching the debris field expand, watching the 3 bodies float in water so cold it would kill them in 4 minutes, except they were already dead. Petty Officer Raymond Callahan, cook 3rd class, former fisherman from Gloucester, Massachusetts, had just sunk a German submarine with a rope rig that cost $6 and took 5 minutes to install. Chief Kowalski turned slowly to look at Callahan. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were wide. Around them, the crew was starting to realize what had happened. Starting to understand that the cook had just done what the entire Atlantic fleet hadn't managed to do. Kill a U-boat with a shallow-depth explosion, starting to see that the bright orange kapok float still bobbing on the surface 100 yards astern marked the grave of 47 men who died because someone remembered how fishermen keep lobster pots at the right depth. Kowalski's expression contained equal parts astonishment, respect, and the dawning realization that they were holding a weapon that could change the entire Battle of the Atlantic. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Callahan could hear. Get down to the rope locker. Rig every remaining depth charge on this ship. We've got 2 more U-boats out there, and I want them dead before sunrise. Callahan didn't wait for further instructions. His hands were shaking again. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization that his rope rig had just killed 47 men and saved potentially thousands. He ran to the rope locker, his boots slipping on the wet deck, his mind already calculating how fast he could rig 23 more depth charges. Behind him, the oil slick from U-552 continued spreading, a dark stain on the Atlantic that would be visible from the air for 3 days before weather dispersed it. The war was about to change. The U-boats were about to die by the dozens, and Callahan's hands were about to start bleeding from tying rope knots in the dark, while German submarines hunted the convoy his ship was supposed to protect. He just didn't know it yet. Callahan's hands were bleeding by sunrise. Rope burns across both palms, where the tarred manila line had dragged through his grip 14 times, cutting through skin that was already raw from years of handling fishing nets in Gloucester. His fingers were stiff, locked in a half-claw shape from tying bowlines in the dark, while Buckley pitched through 15-foot swells, and his hands shook with adrenaline. The blood made the rope slippery, which made the knots harder to tie, which meant he had to grip tighter, which made his hands bleed more. Chief Kowalski had tried to send him to the medical officer twice. Callahan refused both times. "I can tie knots with bleeding hands, Chief. Can't tie them if I'm dead because we ran out of modified charges." By 0521 hours on March 7th, he'd rigged 14 more depth charges with the rope and float system. 14 weapons that could kill U-boats at 40 feet instead of wasting explosives at 150. 14 chances to turn the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic from Germans winning to Germans dying. Around him in the weapons locker, other crew members worked by the glow of red battle lamps, measuring rope lengths, lashing kapok floats together, learning the technique from watching Callahan's bleeding hands move through the motions. Seaman Morrison had tied 3 rigs. Petty Officer Jackson had tied 2. Even Chief Kowalski had tied 1, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble with the bowlines and sheet bends that would either save the convoy or kill everyone on Buckley's fantail if the charges detonated too close to the ship. The second U-boat appeared on sonar at 0521 hours, 1,400 yards northeast of the convoy, running on the surface at 16 knots. Captain Benson's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp with the kind of urgency that came from knowing they were holding a weapon that had just killed 47 Germans and might kill 47 more in the next 10 minutes. "All hands to battle stations. Sonar contact bearing 093, range 1,400 yards, target depth estimated 35 to 40 feet, speed 16 knots. Depth charge attack authorized, modified pattern, 6 charges." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something new in his voice. Not hope exactly, but the absence of the resignation that had colored every previous attack order. "Let's make it 2 for 2, gentlemen." Buckley came to flank speed. The twin diesels roared, 1,500 horsepower driving the screws so hard the stern dug into the water and threw spray 40 feet into the air. The destroyer escort accelerated through morning fog so thick that visibility dropped to 300 yards. Couldn't see the target, couldn't see the convoy, couldn't see anything except gray water and white fog, and the orange kapok float bundles being carried to the fantail by crew members who now understood exactly what those ridiculous-looking life-preserver bundles could do. The fog was a blessing and a curse. Blessing because the U-boat couldn't see Buckley coming until it was too late to dive. Curse because Buckley was navigating entirely by sonar bearings, and if the sonar operator made a mistake, they'd drop 6 depth charges on empty ocean while the U-boat escaped. Range 200 yards, 1,800. The sonar operator called out ranges in the same flat monotone he'd used for 93 failed attacks. But something had changed in the crew. They'd seen U-552 die. They'd watched the submarine's bow break the surface and sink stern first with 47 men screaming inside. They'd heard the screams cut off when the Atlantic closed over the submarine. They knew the rope rigs worked. They knew a cook from Gloucester had figured out how to kill U-boats when the Naval Ordnance Bureau couldn't. And they knew that somewhere 1,000 yards ahead in the fog, 48 more German submariners were about to learn what happened when simple physics met 600 pounds of TNT at exactly the right depth. Range 600 yards. 400. 200. Buckley was closing at 23 knots. The U-boat was running at 16 knots, combined closing speed 39 knots, 66 feet per second. At 100 yards, sonar lost contact. The target had passed into the acoustic shadow directly beneath Buckley's hull. Captain Benson didn't hesitate. "Drop modified pattern." The fantail crew rolled 6 charges off the stern rack at 8-second intervals. 6 650-pound weapons tumbling into the fog. 6 orange Kapok float bundles thrown overboard 1 second after each charge hit the water. Callahan watched from the weapons deck, counting seconds in his head, calculating detonation times. 40 feet at 15 feet per second meant 2.6 seconds to reach depth. 5-second hydrostatic fuse. Total time 7.6 seconds per charge. He got to 5 seconds when the world exploded. 6 depth charges detonated simultaneously at 40 feet. Not sequentially, simultaneously. The charges had hit the water 8 seconds apart, but they'd all reached detonation depth within fractions of a second of each other, and the hydrostatic triggers had fired so close together that the explosions merged into one continuous roar that was louder than anything Callahan had ever heard on George Bank. Louder than the worst storm. Louder than the time his father's trawler had lost an engine, and the remaining diesel had screamed at full throttle for 6 hours straight. This was 3,600 pounds of TNT exploding in a space 200 feet long and 40 feet deep, creating a kill zone where the water itself became a weapon. The shockwave hit Buckley like getting rear-ended by a freight train. Callahan's knees buckled. His vision went white at the edges. The deck plating rang like a gong, and the vibration traveled up through his boots into his bones. In the galley 3 decks below, every coffee cup on the counter launched itself across the compartment and shattered against the opposite wall. In the weapons locker, ammunition cans that had been stacked neatly toppled over like dominoes. On the bridge, the chart table's pencil rolled off and hit the deck. Captain Benson grabbed a support beam to stay upright. Then the geysers erupted. 6 columns of water thrown 80 feet into the air, brown with sediment and black with oil, and filled with debris that Callahan couldn't identify from 200 yards away. The columns merged at their bases, creating a wall of water that looked solid enough to walk on. The noise was overwhelming. Not just the explosions, but a secondary sound, a deep bass rumble that Callahan felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. The sound of water displaced so violently it created pressure waves in the air. And then the U-boat broke the surface. Not gracefully. Not like surfacing. Like being punched through the ceiling of the ocean by a fist made of physics. The submarine's bow shot upward at a 45-degree angle 60 yards astern, seawater cascading off the hull in white sheets that caught what little light penetrated the fog. For 3 seconds, she hung there, suspended between ocean and sky, and Callahan could see every detail. The conning tower painted in gray-green camouflage, the deck gun unmanned and pointing at nothing, the jumping wire running from bow to stern. The conning tower hatch swung open, the metal cover clanging against the frame hard enough that the sound carried across 60 yards of open water. Men appeared in the opening. German submariners in dark coveralls, scrambling onto the deck like ants abandoning a drowning nest. 14 of them. Callahan counted. Some carried life vests, the German version, square and orange, looking almost identical to the American Kapok preservers that had been repurposed to kill their submarine. Most didn't have vests. Most just had terror on their faces, visible even through 60 yards of fog, the kind of expression that transcended language and nationality, and made it clear they knew they were about to die. The captain came last. Oberleutnant Sergei Hans Troyer, 31 years old, commander of U-221, holder of the Iron Cross Second Class, veteran of 14 combat patrols. He climbed through the conning tower hatch and looked back into the submarine one final time, and Callahan could see him counting crew members, counting survivors, counting how many men he was leaving behind in the flooded compartments below, where seawater was rising at catastrophic speed, and drowning men who were trapped by jammed hatches and collapsed bulkheads, and the simple, brutal fact that submarines were designed to keep water out, which meant they were very good at keeping people in. The stern gave up its fight with physics. U-221 tilted past 45 degrees, past 60, past vertical. The sailors on deck lost their footing. Callahan watched them slide down the hull, grabbing at anything: hatch covers, periscope fittings, each other. One sailor grabbed the deck gun's barrel and held on for 2 seconds before his grip failed, and he fell 30 feet into the Atlantic. Another caught the jumping wire and hung there, his legs kicking at empty air, before the wire snapped and dropped him into the water with a splash that was lost in the chaos of the submarine sinking. 3 sailors hit the water before U-221 went under. 11 were still clinging to the hull when it slid beneath the surface, and Callahan watched them make the decision: hold on to the submarine that was about to drag them to the ocean floor, or let go and take their chances in water so cold it would kill them in 4 minutes if rescue didn't come. 8 let go. 3 held on. The submarine sank stern first, pulling the 3 sailors down with it, and Callahan never saw them surface. Oil erupted from where U-221 disappeared, a spreading stain 50 feet across that marked where 48 submariners had been alive 5 minutes ago. 11 were in the water now, swimming weakly toward each other, trying to form a cluster that would be easier for rescue boats to spot. 3 were already face down, dead from internal injuries that the explosion had inflicted, even though they'd been inside a pressure hull designed to withstand depth charges. The remaining 8 were shouting in German, words that Callahan didn't understand but whose meaning was universal. "We're drowning. Help us. Save us." Captain Benson ordered rescue boats deployed. Buckley came about, lowering motor launches that could pick up survivors before hypothermia killed them. The crew worked fast. 4 minutes in 4-degree water was the limit of human survival, and 2 of those minutes were already gone. The motor launches reached the survivors at 3 minutes 30 seconds. They hauled 11 German sailors aboard. 8 were alive. 3 had died in the 90 seconds it took the boats to reach them, their hearts stopped by cold that penetrated German Navy-issue coveralls, like the fabric wasn't even there. The 8 survivors were brought aboard Buckley soaking wet, covered in crude oil that stank like diesel and death, shivering so violently their teeth chattered loud enough to hear from 10 feet away. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, blonde hair plastered to his skull, eyes wide with shock. He kept repeating the same phrase in broken English, the same 2 words over and over. "What weapon? What weapon?" The translator, a Polish-American sailor from Brooklyn named Kowalski, no relation to the chief, tried to explain through a combination of English, German, and hand gestures. The words didn't seem to register. The German kid looked at Callahan, looked at the rope rig being installed on another depth charge, looked back at Callahan. Then he laughed. Not humor, hysteria, the kind of laugh that came from a mind trying to process the impossible. "A rope?" he said in heavily accented English. "A rope killed my ship?" He laughed harder, the sound rising in pitch until it wasn't laughter anymore, but something closer to sobbing. 48 men. A rope. Got him, Himmel." The medic injected him with something, morphine, probably, and the laughter cut off mid-breath as the German kid's eyes rolled back and he slumped against the bulkhead. Captain Benson radioed Commander Task Group 2115 at 0604 hours with a message that would reach Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, by Oro 800. Sank 2 U-boats this date using experimental depth charge modification developed by ship's cook, PO3 Raymond Callahan. Modification consists of 40-foot rope tether and kapok float bundle maintaining charges at shallow depth. Results: 2 confirmed kills, 95 enemy KIA, 11 POW. 0 friendly casualties. Request permission to disseminate technique fleet-wide. Acknowledge. He sent the message and waited, knowing that Fleet Command would either think he was insane or would recognize that a cook had just solved a problem that had been killing Allied sailors for 3 years. The response came back in 47 minutes. 47 minutes was the fastest tactical approval Benson had ever received from Fleet Command. Usually it took 3 days to get authorization to change the color of paint on the deck railings. Modification approved immediate implementation. Provide complete technical specifications including rope length, float specifications, installation procedures, deployment techniques. All Atlantic escort vessels to be equipped within 72 hours. Bureau of Ordnance to evaluate for formal adoption. Commendation authorized for PO3 Callahan. Acknowledge. But there were still 3 U-boats in the Wolf Pack. The 3rd submarine made the fatal mistake of attacking convoy HX-229 at 0734 hours, while Buckley was still in the area, its captain apparently unaware that 2 of his sister boats had been destroyed in the past 2 hours. U-384, under Captain Lieutenant Hans Achim von Rosenberg-Gruszczynski, fired 2 torpedoes at the merchant ship Daniel Webster from 2,100 yards. Sonar detected the torpedo launch, tracked the bubbles rising from the torpedo's compressed air propulsion, triangulated the firing position. Benson ordered pursuit before the German captain could dive to safe depth. This attack was different because Buckley had refined the deployment technique. Instead of dropping charges in a straight line astern, Benson ordered a circular pattern. 4 charges spaced 90 degrees apart, deployed while Buckley executed a tight turn that would place the U-boat at the center of the circle. If Callahan's rope rigs worked as intended, the charges would detonate at 40 feet simultaneously from 4 different directions, creating a kill zone 120 feet in diameter from which there was no escape. It was experimental. It was untested. It was also brilliant, assuming the physics worked out. Range 1,000 yards, 800, 600. The U-boat was diving now, but slowly. Crash dive procedures called for flooding ballast tanks and pushing the bow down while maintaining forward momentum. But that took time. 30 seconds minimum, usually closer to 45. Buckley closed the distance. Range 400, 200. At 100 yards, Benson gave the order. Execute circular pattern. Buckley turned hard to port, heeling over 15 degrees, throwing everyone on deck against the starboard railings. The fantail crew rolled charge number 1. Benson held the turn, the ship carving a circle through the water. 8 seconds later, charge 2, then 3, then 4. 4 depth charges spaced 90 degrees apart, 4 orange kapok float bundles marking the corners of an invisible square. Callahan watched from the weapons deck, trying to visualize the geometry. If the U-boat was at the center, and the charges were spaced 60 feet apart, and they all detonated at 40 feet deep. The 4 charges exploded within 0.3 seconds of each other. The noise was different this time. Not louder. Different. Instead of one massive roar, it was 4 distinct detonations that overlapped and interfered with each other, creating harmonics that sounded almost musical for a fraction of a second before physics reasserted itself and turned music into violence. The shockwaves converged from 4 directions, north, south, east, west, traveling through water at 5,000 feet per second, compressing the space where U-384 hung suspended at 40 feet, trying to reach 100 feet and safety. The submarine never had a chance. The pressure hull, designed to withstand 150 meters of depth, faced forces equivalent to 400 meters in a fraction of a second. The steel buckled inward at 6 points simultaneously. Rivets the size of a man's thumb sheared off and became shrapnel traveling at supersonic speeds through the submarine's interior. Bulkheads collapsed. Pipes burst. Electrical cables snapped and discharged 440 volts into salt water. The 46 German submariners inside died before their brains could process what was happening. Instant compression trauma that turned organs to pulp and crushed skulls like eggshells and broke bones that had been intact for 20, 25, 30 years until one moment when physics decided those bones were too fragile to survive. U-384 imploded. Not sank, imploded. The pressure hull crushed inward on itself like a beer can in a hydraulic press, compressing 46 men and all their equipment into a space half the submarine's original volume in less time than it took to blink. The implosion created a secondary shock wave, a bubble of displaced water that rose toward the surface at 40 feet per second. When it hit the surface, it threw a geyser 100 feet into the air. Not white water, not brown water, but dark gray water that looked almost black. Water that had absorbed so much energy from the implosion that it was actually warmer than the surrounding ocean. The submarine sank so fast that no debris reached the surface, no oil slick, no bodies, no evidence except a massive air bubble that continued rising for 3 minutes after the implosion, and an expanding circle of disturbed water that looked like someone had thrown a boulder into the ocean from 200 feet up. Sonar tracked the wreckage as it fell. The crushed pressure hull tumbling end over end, sinking at terminal velocity, hitting the ocean floor 220 meters down with an impact that registered on Buckley's sonar as a single sharp ping. U-384 and 46 German submariners were now part of the Atlantic seabed, crushed so completely that recovery would be impossible even if anyone wanted to try. 3 U-boats destroyed in less than 4 hours. 141 German submariners dead. Convoy HX-229 proceeding toward Britain with 0 additional losses after losing 2 tankers in the first 4 hours. The mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic had just changed fundamentally, and nobody in the Kriegsmarine realized it yet. By March 10, 1943, 3 days after Callahan tied his first rope rig, every destroyer, escort, destroyer, and corvette in the Western Approaches Command had received technical specifications for the modification. The signal went out at 800 on March 8th, transmitted by Fleet Command to every escort vessel in the Atlantic. Immediate all commands depth charge modification approved for fleet deployment. Attach 40-foot manila rope to tail fins. Attach float providing 300 lbs buoyancy to opposite end. Deploy float immediately after charge. Charge will detonate at rope length. Effective immediately. Acknowledge. By March 10th, 487 escort vessels had acknowledged and implemented. By March 15th, the entire Atlantic Fleet was equipped. The British Admiralty designated it Tethered Shallow Depth Charge System in official documents because the British had to give everything formal names that sounded like they'd been invented by committees of engineers with advanced degrees. The sailors who used it called it the Gloucester Rig after Callahan's hometown, because sailors didn't care about formal names and preferred to call things after the places that produced the people who invented them. Implementation was rapid because the modification required only materials already available aboard every escort vessel. Manila rope from ship's stores, kapok life preservers from emergency equipment lockers, riggers who could tie bowlines in their sleep. Cost per modification, $6. Installation time, 5 minutes. No specialized tools required, no factory modifications, no engineering degrees necessary. It was the kind of elegant simplicity that only came from someone who'd spent years solving practical problems with limited resources. Someone who understood that the best solutions weren't always the most complicated ones. HMS Starling, a modified Black Swan-class sloop under command of Captain Frederick John Walker, became the first British vessel to test the Gloucester rig on March 16th, during an attack on U-boats shadowing convoy HX-230. Walker was already the Royal Navy's most successful U-boat hunter, with 6 confirmed kills, and he had the kind of tactical mind that recognized immediately what Callahan's modification meant for anti-submarine warfare. He ordered his crew to rig 30 depth charges with the rope and float system, then deliberately positioned Starling to intercept a U-boat that British intelligence had detected through Enigma decryption, and whose position had been radioed to all escort vessels with instructions to engage and destroy with prejudice. The subsequent attack destroyed U-432 with all hands, 48 German submariners killed when 4 shallow depth charges detonated in a square pattern that crushed the submarine's pressure hull from multiple directions simultaneously. Walker sent a message to the Admiralty that became famous among escort crews, reprinted in fleet bulletins, and posted on notice boards in every port from Halifax to Gibraltar. The Gloucester rig transforms depth charges from harassment weapons to execution devices. Recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption and formal commendation for the American cook who invented it. Suggest we owe this man approximately 4,000 lives. We'll buy him a pint if our paths cross. Walker. The impact spread like wildfire through both fleets. Between March 15th and March 31st, 1943, Allied escort vessels using the Gloucester rig sank 23 U-boats in the North Atlantic. Standard depth charge attacks during the same period accounted for only 4 kills. The statistical difference was so dramatic, so undeniable, that even the most conservative naval officers who typically resisted innovation had to admit the cook from Gloucester had changed the war. Depth charge effectiveness jumped from 3% to 68% in 16 days. U-boat life expectancy dropped from an average of 14 combat patrols to an average of 3.7. German submarine crews started calling the North Atlantic the graveyard, and they weren't wrong. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, issued emergency tactical directives on April 2nd ordering all submarines to remain fully submerged during convoy attacks and to avoid running on the surface even when outside Allied aircraft range. The directive, intercepted and decrypted by British intelligence, acknowledged that the enemy has developed a shallow-depth explosive device of devastating effectiveness against surfaced or near-surface submarines, and warned that U-boats operating at depths less than 50 meters face immediate destruction with near certainty. German naval intelligence never identified the weapon as a simple rope modification of standard depth charges. They assumed it was sophisticated new ordnance from American factories, possibly radar-guided or using proximity fuses. The idea that it was $6 of rope and some life preservers tied together by a cook never occurred to them, because that seemed too simple, too improvised, too desperate to be effective. But Dönitz's tactical changes came too late to save the U-boat fleet. The Gloucester rig had fundamentally altered the risk equation in a way that no amount of tactical adaptation could overcome. Previously, U-boats could attack convoys while running on the surface, using their superior speed and low profile to escape pursuing escorts. They could position themselves ahead of convoys, dive to periscope depth only long enough to fire torpedoes, then surface and escape before depth charges arrived. Now, any surfaced submarine within sonar range of an Allied warship faced near certain destruction. Depth charges that used to explode harmlessly 150 feet below now detonated at exactly the depth where U-boats were most vulnerable. And submarines forced to remain submerged couldn't generate the speed necessary to catch convoys, couldn't maintain position ahead of merchant ships, couldn't execute the wolf-pack tactics that had made them so effective in 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic hadn't ended. U-boats continued operating through 1944 and into 1945. But the balance had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, and it shifted in March 1943, when a cook remembered how his father kept lobster pots at the right depth. During April and May 1943, the period historians later called Black May for the catastrophic U-boat losses, Allied escorts sank 47 German submarines in the North Atlantic. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval Historical Center determined that 34 of those kills involved shallow-depth attacks consistent with the Gloucester rig technique. The remaining 13 involved aircraft, ramming, or standard depth charges against deeply submerged targets. The casualty statistics were even more striking. During March 1943, before widespread adoption of the Gloucester rig, U-boats sank 120 Allied merchant ships with 627,000 tons of cargo and approximately 3,100 sailors killed. During May 1943, after fleet-wide implementation, U-boats sank only 50 merchant ships totaling 264,000 tons, with approximately 1,200 casualties. The difference represented roughly 1,100 Allied sailors who came home alive because a cook had remembered how his father rigged lobster pots. Callahan received the Navy Cross on July 14, 1943, in a ceremony aboard USS Texas while the battleship was anchored in Norfolk. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of duty, Petty Officer 3rd Class Raymond Callahan, while serving aboard USS Buckley, DE-51, during anti-submarine operations against enemy U-boats, did develop and implement an innovative weapons modification that significantly enhanced anti-submarine warfare effectiveness and directly resulted in the destruction of multiple enemy vessels and the preservation of numerous Allied lives. His initiative, technical skill, and devotion to duty reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service." Admiral Ingersoll personally pinned the medal on Callahan's dress blues and said 6 words that Callahan never forgot. "You saved 4,000 men with rope." The Navy promoted him to Chief Petty Officer, assigned him to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C., and spent the remainder of 1943 having him train other crews in advanced depth charge tactics and modifications. The Navy offered him officer's commission. They wanted to make him an ensign, put him through training, turn him into a proper officer who could teach at the Naval Academy and write doctrine manuals. Callahan declined. He had no interest in being an officer. He had no interest in staying in Washington. He wanted to return to Gloucester after the war and resume commercial fishing, which is exactly what he did in September 1945, after VJ Day, when the Navy released him from service with a chest full of medals and hands that still carried rope burn scars from March 7, 1943. He purchased a 42-foot fishing trawler named Margaret Ann after his mother, outfitted her for cod and haddock, and fished Georges Bank for 37 years. He rarely talked about his wartime service except to note that the ocean teaches you physics whether you go to college or not. The other fishermen in Gloucester knew he'd won the Navy Cross, but most didn't know what for. They knew him as the guy who always tied the best knots, who could gauge water depth by watching wave patterns, who never lost gear because he understood how to rig equipment to stay at the right depth, no matter what the weather did. When new fishermen asked him for advice on rigging lobster pots, he'd show them the knots and explain the physics, and never mention that the same principles had killed 9 U-boats and saved 4,200 lives. He died in 1987 at age 68 from lung cancer, probably from smoking 2 packs a day for 40 years, not from anything related to the war. His obituary in the Gloucester Daily Times mentioned his Navy Cross, but didn't explain the technical details of what he'd invented. Raymond Red Callahan, 68, commercial fisherman, Navy veteran, dies, read the headline. The article was 200 words, mostly about his fishing career and his family. One sentence mentioned the war. Callahan served with distinction in the U.S. Navy during World War II, receiving the Navy Cross for actions in the Atlantic Theater. That was it. No mention of rope, no mention of U-boats, no mention of 4,200 lives saved. Most of Gloucester's fishing community attended his funeral. His wife, Margaret, the Margaret Ann's namesake, lived another 15 years. His 3 children grew up, had children of their own, none of whom went into fishing because the industry was dying and the ocean was being emptied by factory ships. Only his family knew he'd sunk 9 U-boats with a rope trick. Only they knew that the knots he'd taught them for tying Christmas presents and securing boats to docks were the same knots that had killed 141 German submariners in March 1943. The Gloucester rig itself remained in use through the end of World War II and into the Cold War era, when more sophisticated weapons like homing torpedoes and nuclear depth charges replaced conventional explosives. But the fundamental principle, keeping ordnance at optimal depth through simple physical means rather than complex electronics, influenced naval weapons design for decades. Modern anti-submarine rockets still use tethered float systems for shallow water operations. The rope that Callahan tied on March 7, 1943, became a piece of naval ordnance doctrine that outlasted the war it helped win and the man who invented it. On March 7, 2023, the 80th anniversary of U-552's sinking, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS John Basilone, DDG-122, conducted a memorial ceremony 600 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia, near the coordinates where Buckley had made her first kill using the Gloucester rig. The crew dropped a wreath into the Atlantic, a circle of flowers held together with rope tied in bowlines, floating on the surface, held up by life preservers. They honored both the Allied sailors who'd fought the U-boats and the German submariners who'd died in the cold darkness 220 meters below. The ceremony concluded with a reading of Callahan's Navy Cross citation and a simple statement from the ship's captain, Commander Sarah Mitchell, 42 years old, Naval Academy class of 2003, holder of 2 Bronze Stars and 1 very clear understanding of naval history. This cook saved thousands of lives with $6 of rope and a fishing boat education. That's the kind of American ingenuity we still honor today. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars, not because it's complicated, but because it's simple enough to work when nothing else does. The wreath floated on the surface, held up by kapok life preservers, exactly 40 feet of rope attached to a commemorative plaque that sank slowly toward the ocean floor. The physics hadn't changed in 80 years. Water still had the same density. Rope still had the same tensile strength. Depth charges still exploded with the same force. The lesson remained simple, elegant, brutal. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem isn't complex engineering or advanced technology. Sometimes it's just a man who remembers how his father kept lobster pots at the right depth and has the courage to try something everyone else said wouldn't work. Sometimes it's $6 of rope that changes the outcome of a war. Sometimes the cook knows more than the admiral, and sometimes the most important innovations come from people who never went to college, who learned physics from the ocean instead of textbooks, who tied knots for a living and accidentally figured out how to kill submarines while everyone else was still trying to build better depth charges. Callahan never knew he'd become a legend. He went back to fishing. He tied his knots. He caught his cod. And 4,200 Allied sailors came home alive because he remembered something simple that everyone else had forgotten.